And just a couple of housekeeping things to start is if you could have your mics muted for now. At the very end, if you'd like to open your mic for questions, I'll take questions at the end. During the presentation, you can feel free to type questions into the chat box, and I may not notice it right away, but if I see it, then I'll address some questions through the chat box as we go along. So without any further ado, my name is Alicia Kallal, and I'm an Extension Educator in Southern Illinois. I serve Franklin, Jackson, Perry, Randolph, and Williamson counties. And this evening's presentation will be on preserving flowers. And I will make a note that the handout slides that you got in the email when you registered are almost entirely the same as this current presentation, but I did make just a couple of changes where I split some slides into 2 slides so that I could add a few more pictures. So most of the information didn't change, but I did add some pictures. But I will be sending the updated version to our coordinator so that she can also put that updated version out to make it available to people. So with that, I will go ahead and launch right in. So to begin this presentation, I just want to reflect for a moment on why people might be interested in preserving or drying flowers. And one of the main reasons is we all know that fresh flowers, when we get cut flowers as arrangements or in vases, are beautiful and wonderful, but they have a very short lifespan. Typically, the vase life of cut flowers is 1, maybe 2 weeks long. And if we would like to enjoy our flowers for a longer period of time, drying is one way that we can do that. So arrangements made from dried or preserved flowers are long-lasting. You don't have to remember to refill the vase, so they don't really have any care that's required. And so that can be one reason that people might like to dry their flowers. Another kind of gardener-oriented reason is drying flowers is an inexpensive way to extend your gardening hobby from just the outside portion in your flower garden, but bring it into a more arts and crafts kind of indoor portion. And so it's a kind of fun, simple way to extend your garden activities and can be done by pretty much anybody. So this is a great thing, I think, for a lot of people to maybe bring some of nature into their homes and use it for decorative purposes. And when we're wanting to preserve flowers, the very first step is choosing the plant material that we are going to preserve. And there's a few rules of thumb that you can use when making decisions about what plant material you're going to use. And the first rule of thumb is that you always want to collect more than what you're going to need for the project that you have in mind. So if you have in mind a project of either a vase arrangement or of doing some pressed flowers for stationery, you want to make sure that you collect more blooms than what you'll actually need, because not all of them will turn out as pretty as others. So there will definitely be a gradient of ones that turn out looking really nice and ones that turn out looking kind of silly. So we always want to collect more than we need. And we also want to choose flowers that are in their best condition. So we want to choose foliage and flowers that are free of either insect or disease damage, something that looks like it's in its prime. And when we are making decisions about how we're going to preserve the flowers, that will also influence the developmental stage that we would harvest at. So for air drying, we want to make sure we choose blooms that are not fully open, not all the way to their peak, because they will kind of open up a little bit more during that drying process. And so we want to not have them right at their peak, because we're more likely to shed petals if we wait to peak. For our other methods of preservation, like pressing and using desiccants, for those we can select blooms that are in their prime, so at peak bloom. and not beyond peak bloom. So we all kind of have maybe a sense of when a flower blooms, it starts out fairly tight bud, and then we gradually begin to see color, and then it'll fully open, and then it'll still be in bloom, but it will be past prime, where the petals are starting to brown or wrinkle. And so we want to make sure we avoid those past prime blooms because they won't dry as well either. And then when we are making our decisions about harvesting, it's also important to consider the time of day that we harvest. If we harvest in the morning as soon as possible after the dew has dried, that's the optimal time to harvest cut flowers because that's when the plants are the most turgid or the most full of water when they've been through that nighttime cycle where the temperatures were cool. But we do want to avoid cutting when there is dew on because that dew will slow the drying process, and it's always a good practice to avoid working in the garden when there's dew on the garden because that's when plants are at their most susceptible to disease transmission, primarily fungal diseases. And so we want to avoid being the human vector walking through the garden and potentially spreading fungal spores onto those wet leaves. So waiting until after the dew, but as soon as possible in the morning after that point, is our optimal time for flower harvest. And it's important to realize that any plant material that has wilted is not going to dry well. So when we're doing our harvesting, we want to make sure that we're doing it as efficiently as we can so that we're not hanging on to them in the outdoor heat for too long so that they don't start to wilt before we begin our processing. So now I'll go into the details of 4 different methods that you can use for flower and foliage preservation. And so I'll just go through each of these in turn, the first of which will be air drying, followed by pressing using desiccants and using glycerin. So for our first method, air drying, this method works fairly well for many different types of flowers, grasses, seed pods, and when we're doing air drying, typically we're hanging those flowers upside down. And this method works especially well for flowers that are termed everlastings. And everlasting flowers typically have a low natural moisture content in their petals, and their petals are fairly robust. They're not too thin. So you can think of things like straw flower, which is a naturally very dry bloom, and so it lends itself very well to air drying. So that would be maybe converse to some of our other more delicate or more succulent plants. So I'll go through some examples of different plants that work really well for air drying. And on this slide, there's a picture of a rose that was still in a fairly tight bud that was hung upside down to dry. And so roses in this stage, the tight bud stage, work well for air drying. If the rose opens up to its peak bloom, again, that's more likely to shed petals and not be as well preserved. Some other flowers that work really well for air drying include statice, sea lavender, straw flower, yarrow, and then like I mentioned, a lot of seed pods also work really well for air drying. So the photo in the bottom right corner is the seed pod of Love in a Mist. And so these are really easy to dry. A lot of our grass seed heads also are very easy to dry, or they pretty much are already dried in nature, and we don't really have to do a lot more to get them fully dry. And so these are some of the things that work really well with this method. And so to begin the process, once we've harvested our plant material for air drying, if we're looking at preserving the flowers, we want to remove the foliage and then create little bundles of our flower stems and then tie them in that bundle with rubber bands. And the reason to use rubber bands rather than something like a cotton twine or a nylon twine is because those pieces of like thread or rope don't change shape. They stay a consistent length. And so as the plant material dries, it actually shrinks. And so if you were to use like that cotton thread, as the plant material dries, it'll actually slip out of the knot that you tied around the bundle. Whereas with the rubber bands, they're elastic, they change shape. And so as that bundle shrinks, the rubber band will still hold it. Another neat trick that you can use is actually just to bend open the paper clips and use those as a hook to attach from your rubber band tie to your clothesline or whatever thing you're going to hang your bundles from. And so once you've got your bundles prepared, you'll put them in a warm, dry, dark area that has good ventilation. And typically for air drying, this will take a couple of weeks for the plant material to fully dry. So you want it to be to a point where if you were to like squish those petals or those leaves in between your fingers, they would just shatter, crumble. So obviously they're going to be fairly fragile, so you'll want to handle them carefully, but you do want them to be completely dry before you use them for whatever purpose you've dried them for. And some plant material, some flowers have really weak stems, and so if you are worried about weak stems, one thing that you can do is essentially create a wire stem replacement so that you can use that wire like a stem when you're making an arrangement. And I'll talk about how we do that now. So there's two methods that we use for wiring flowers. So this first hook method is what we use for ray flowers or open face flowers that have either a hollow stem or a soft base. And so the way this works is you'll follow this diagram from left to right so that you start with your wire and you thread it up through the stem and through the center of the flower. Then you bend the end of that wire back down into a U or a hook, and then you pull that down through the center of the flower and allow that wire to go either back down through the stem or on the outside of the stem. And so you pull that all the way until the hook is underneath of the little anthers or the center of that flower. So you won't see the hook anymore. It's actually pulled in just below where that center plant material is. So it's not visible anymore. And so then you're able to use this piece of wire as a stem so that you don't have to worry about whether the stem breaks or not. The second method that we use for wiring flowers is the crosswire method, and we use this method when the flower has a hard base, so it wouldn't be possible to thread up through the base. And this would be plants like carnations or roses that we would use this type of wiring method. And so with this, you actually push that wire through the receptacle or the base of the flower at a horizontal to the flower, and then you just take and treat it like a twist tie and wrap it around the stem, and that gives you your wire to use as a stem replacement. All right, so now that we've talked about air drying, we'll move on to our second method, which is pressing. And when we're choosing flowers that work well for pressing, we want to avoid really fleshy or thick leaves and petals. And we also want to avoid petals that are too thin, because these will tend to, if they're too thick, they don't dry out very well when pressed. And if they're too thin, they tend to kind of stick to the paper that you use to press them, and then they become very difficult to remove from that paper, and so they tend to tear. So some examples of flowers that work well when pressing include things like pansies, chrysanthemums, delphinium, Queen Anne's lace, cosmos, and bleeding heart. So a lot of our flowers do well for pressing, but we just want to avoid things that are really thick or really thin. And for pressing, again, like all of our other methods, we want to use flowers that are in prime condition. But with pressing, you can actually choose multiple stages of development to create variety in your design. So what I mean by this is you could harvest flower buds that are not open yet, some that are just starting to open or just starting to show color, and harvest some that are in full prime bloom. And then when you press those, you'll have different design elements that you can use that'll work together as a theme because it's all one plant. But it'll be in different shapes because it's at different stages of development. And so when we're pressing, first we layer our flowers between absorbent material on a flat surface. And absorbent material typically is something like a paper. The paper that's used for making watercolor paintings works really well because it's really absorbent. So if you want to spring for expensive paper, that's great. If you don't want to buy expensive watercolor paper, just things like catalogs that have the paper that's not glossy also work, or like newsprint. Those types of papers will also work, but you're more likely to need to change that paper in the middle to make sure you get the drying done quickly. And so one of the trickiest parts about pressing is getting the flowers to lay flat and getting them to be orderly the way you want them when you put them between the sheets of paper. And so what I find has been most helpful for me to accomplish this is to lay my flowers on my first sheet of paper and then to take my top sheet and roll it from left to right or right to left, whichever you prefer, but just sort of gently roll it from one side to the other so that you don't get the petals bent in awkward angles as you lay it down. And so then you'll take that absorbent material and place it underneath of some heavy objects like books, master gardener manuals, whatever heavy objects you have. You can also use a flower press, which is what's pictured here underneath of all the books, as essentially a wooden frame that you put the cardboard and absorbent paper in stacks. And so that just helps you to kind of keep confined all of your pressing sheets. But you can do it without a frame just as easily as you can with one. And so after a couple of days of being in between the paper under the weighted object, you'll want to come back and check to see if that paper is really damp. And if the paper is really damp, you'll want to very carefully detach the flowers from the paper. You might need to use something like a toothpick to help you gently free them without tearing, and then change to fresh, dry paper. And what this does is it'll help to speed up the drying process, and the faster you get the flowers dry, the better they'll retain their color and not turn as dingy looking. So speed of drying is really the best thing in terms of getting them to look as best as you can. Another thing to think about when you're doing pressing is that there's also different orientations that you can lay the flowers down in the paper. With our ray flowers, if you think of like a sunflower, it seems pretty obvious that you would put them face up. But for other flowers that have more of a three-dimensional shape rather than a two-dimensional shape, you might have to experiment to see what looks the best. So in that picture, the two kind of yellow flowers in the top left corner are two nasturtium blooms, and nasturtium has kind of this three-dimensional shape, and so the one was laid essentially on the bloom from the side, and the other was laid from the top. And the one from the side produces a really beautiful kind of hooded shape, whereas the one pressed from the top just looks kind of ugly because of the way the petals break and splay apart. So you might have to experiment with some different angles or facings with some of these flowers to see what looks the best. Another thing I want to mention is that colors do change during drying, and typically what we see is our yellows and oranges tend to stay the most true to color when pressing. So the nasturtium is a really bright orange naturally, and then after it's dried, it stays this kind of yellowy orange color. A lot of our darker colors tend to get even darker. So on the right top, that's some purple ruffles basil, which if you've seen it when it's fresh or alive, it has a bright purple color, fairly deep kind of maroon, but when it's dried, it really gets very dark, almost black. And then some flowers also lose their color. So borage, when dried, which alive, I have a picture of it over on the left of that really bright blue. And then in the lower picture of the dried flowers, those two blooms are borage blooms that I dried. And they basically lose all of their color and just become a kind of tan. So depending on what the pigments are in those flowers, they may or may not hold very well when pressing. All right. The next method of preservation I'll talk about is using desiccants. And while there are technically a couple of different types of desiccants, in terms of home use, silica gel is really the best for use, and so that's pretty much the only thing that I recommend for people. But the nice thing about using a desiccant like silica gel is that it removes the water very quickly from the flowers, and it also supports the flower in its three-dimensional original shape, so it keeps its original shape when it dries. And this is definitely the quickest method of drying, and it also, because it's the quickest, has the best color retention potential. But when you're choosing flowers to dry using a desiccant, you do want to avoid flowers that shed their petals very easily because they're fairly likely to just sort of fall apart once they've been dried. But some examples of flowers that work really well with this method include things like Alstroemeria, which is pictured here, gladiolus, marigold, zinnia, and really a lot of flowers can be dried using a desiccant. So like I said, silica gel is really the best desiccant for home use, and it also has the advantage of being reusable. So typically the way silica gel comes for this purpose, it will have indicator crystals in it. And so when they're dry, they'll be blue. And then when they get wet, they change to pink. And so what this does is it allows you to see whether the silica has absorbed as much moisture as it's able to. When all of the crystals have turned pink, it's not going to take up any more moisture. And so typically, for one round of drying flowers, the silica has plenty of capacity to pull out all that moisture. And then you can, when you remove that silica from the flowers, re-dry it on something like a rimmed cookie sheet in your oven at 250 degrees. It typically takes about an hour, but you can also watch if you have those indicator crystals to see once they've turned blue again, then you know that the silica is dry. But one thing to note when using silica is that you need to use an airtight container because the silica gel is also pulling moisture out of ambient room air. And so if you don't have a sealed container, it'll pull the moisture out of the air and out of the flowers, but not as efficiently out of the flowers, and so they won't dry as well. So using a sealed container is important. So here you can see I used this is actually after the flowers are dried, but I just stored them in with the silica so that they would stay dry and not, get damp in my house or something. But just one of those like Ziploc plastic containers works really well for using silica as a desiccant to dry flowers. And so when we're using the silica gel, our ray flowers we do face up, and so you'll fill the bottom of the container with about 1 inch of the silica and then gently work the base of that flower into the gel, and then you'll sift more of that silica gel over the top, making sure that you get it in between the petals and get all of the petals covered up completely. And then once you've covered up the flowers completely, you want to tap the container gently to settle the silica and make sure that none of the flowers became visible again. If any of them came back to the surface, then you want to go ahead and add more silica till they're all completely covered. And so I said ray flowers we do face up, But for some flowers, particularly flowers that are on a spike or a raceme, we want to make sure to keep all of those flowers from getting squished, and we want to have them all underneath of the silica gel. So we actually put them horizontally and use some kind of a prop to keep the top of the stem from laying flat so that we don't crush those lower flowers. So you want all the flumes to keep their three-dimensional shape, so you have to put that spike at an angle. And so then, once you've got your spike all set up the way you want it, typically you'll start still with that layer of silica gel in the bottom of your container. Then you'll stick in your spike and set up the prop, and then fill in the silica around it. And you have to be careful as you do this to make sure you don't get any of the petals kind of bent by the silica. You want to make sure you're getting in between all the petals but keeping them in their proper shape. And so this is just kind of a slow process of building up around them and making sure they stay the way they should. And so again, sometimes it's helpful to have some kind of a little tool like a toothpick or something to help you kind of keep putting those petals back where they belong if the silica kind of moves it around. So you just kind of fill up until you've completely covered that spike, and then you're good to go. And so in the silica gel, you typically only need about 2 to 5 days for your flowers to dry. And once they've dried, they'll still have their three-dimensional shape, but they will be fairly brittle or fragile, and so you want to be very careful in the way that you remove them from the silica gel. And so to start, I like to just take the container and kind of tilt it sideways so that some of that silica starts to flow to one side, and then some of the flowers start to appear. And so once you start to see the tops of flowers, you can take your fingers and scoop up from underneath and gently lift them up out of the silica. And once you've got them up out of the silica, you can turn them upside down, and some of the silica gel will fall out by itself, but some of those silica beads will be trapped inside of the petals, and so you'll have to use something like a little paintbrush or a toothpick to kind of work them out of the petals, because those petals sort of dry and curl up around the little silica beads. So it's a little bit of a tedious project where you have to kind of work out all the little silica beads from those petals, but this does really do a great job of preserving colors more vibrantly and keeping that shape really well. All right, the last method of preservation that I'll talk about is glycerinizing. And so in this method, we actually are able to preserve foliage as well as flowers. And this method is really used primarily for foliage. And what's unique about glycerinizing is that this is really the only method of preservation where the end product is still pliable rather than brittle. Because instead of just removing the water, what we're actually doing is using glycerin to replace the water in that plant material. And so we can use glycerin to replace that water in foliage branches up to about 18 inches long. If you get longer than that, you don't really get good pull or transpiration essentially of that glycerin up through all of the conductive tissue. So the glycerin, essentially, you're putting it in like you would a vase, and that glycerin is coming up through the xylem, or the conductive tissue that carries the water through the plant material, and as the glycerin moves up through, it's replacing the water, and that leaves you with leaves and stems that are preserved but also still fairly flexible. And a lot of different foliage materials can be preserved with this method, but some that work really well include things like eucalyptus, which is what's pictured here, English ivy, magnolia, and salal. So a lot of our foliage for arrangements, it's really great to use a glycerinized foliage because it gives a little bit more life to your dried arrangement. A dried arrangement would look kind of stiff and unnatural if it was just dried flowers or dried blooms. So being able to use a glycerinized foliage really helps to give you some more delicate curves and give you a little bit more of a lifelike looking arrangement. So when we begin the process of glycerinizing, first we want to start by selecting our branches with the shapes or the curves that we really are looking for, because once we've preserved them, we do have a little bit of flexibility to be able to bend and shape them, but it's easiest to start with plant material that has the shape you already want. So fighting with a branch that doesn't have the curves you want is not nearly as much fun as working with a branch that already is shaped the way you want it. And when we begin the process, we really treat the plant material a lot like we would if we were going to put it into a vase. So we remove the lower leaves from the stem, which is what we would do if we were putting it in a vase, because any of those leaves that are in our liquid solution are just going to be a problem in terms of starting to mold, and so we don't want them. So we remove those, and then our glycerin solution, we mix 1 part glycerin with 2 parts of warm water. And it is important that we use warm water rather than cold water, because warm water is going to be taken up into the plant material more quickly, and so it's going to give a better jump start on getting that glycerin moving through that plant material. One other tip that I've found with the glycerin solution that can be helpful is to add some vinegar or citric acid to help lower the pH and prevent mold growth. Sometimes the plant material has exudates that are great, sugar content things that mold really likes. And so having that lower pH helps to keep your glycerin solution from molding. And so that's one thing that I have found to be helpful. And so for your glycerin, you want to fill a glass container. It's better to use glass than it is to use plastic. And you want to fill to a depth of 4 to 5 inches. And either use a container that already has markings on it like a mason jar, or go ahead and mark with a marker or something to know what the level of that solution was when you started, because you are going to be replacing solution as the process goes on to keep glycerin going up into the plant material over a couple of weeks that it takes to get the whole branch full of glycerin. And so when you've got your glycerin solution all mixed up, you've got your level full, then you want to freshly cut the ends of the branches, just like you do when you're putting branches or flowers into a new vase. So you want to cut those at 45-degree angles. This is just making sure that we have clear openings on the ends of our branches so that that glycerin solution can go up through that stem. And so as we'll put those in our solution and watch as the level drops, we'll refill with a replacement solution. And the replacement solution has a little bit of a weaker dilution of the glycerin, so we use 1 part glycerin to 4 parts water rather than 2 parts water. So it's a little bit thinner, a little bit weaker, but we'll use that over the course of the period as we're refilling up that solution level. And the leaf color will change as the glycerin is absorbed up through the plant material, and you'll also start to see glycerin exuding out through the leaf pores. And so you'll be able to tell as the glycerin is moving through the plant material. And typically this is a fairly long process, and depending on the length of your branches, if they're a little bit longer, it can take a little bit longer. But usually in the neighborhood of 1 to 3 weeks for this process to happen. And like I said, it might take even a little bit longer than that. But once your plant material has taken up glycerin all the way through it, so you've all the way at the tips of those branches, you've seen the glycerin change the color of the leaves, move all the way up through, then you can go ahead and take a soft cloth and wipe off any glycerin that has exuded off of the outside, clean up those branches on the bottom, and then that plant material is preserved and ready to use. And so this is a picture of what that glycerin exudate looks like. So you can see on this eucalyptus how there's little beads of liquid coming out of the leaves, and that's the glycerin as it's pulling up through that plant material and starting to exude out the excess. And one thing to note with glycerinizing is that some of our really thick, waxy leaves might not work particularly well with the stem method. And so for something like magnolia, things that are really thick, maybe holly, it might be easier to use a submerging method instead. And so instead of having the branches in a solution like a vase, you can actually take those thicker leaves and submerge them in your glycerin solution in something like a 9x13 pan or a rimmed cookie sheet, something like that, where you can get a level of glycerin and get those leaves submerged. And so you'll place them just in a single layer on your container and make sure that you weight them down so that they don't float to the top. Because if they float to the top, the glycerin's only in contact with that bottom side of the leaf, and so you won't get as efficient of a preservation. So you just want to weight those down with something that you don't mind getting wet in the glycerin solution, and then that'll take typically 2 to 6 days for those leaves to become pliable as they've absorbed that glycerin. And so once they've done that, you can remove them from the glycerin solution and drain off all of the excess and then wipe them dry with a soft cloth. And another thing that you can do when you're using glycerin to preserve your plant material is you can also add a dye to it to give the colorful color to your foliage as opposed to the kind of brown that you get if you don't use. So this is eucalyptus when it's been preserved with glycerin that doesn't have a color or a dye in it, and so it just kind of turns brown. Whereas you can add dyes like red or green, and then that foliage will have that dyed color. And so you can use food coloring as a dye, and you can also look in to see if there's other dyes available, but food coloring is one that you can use that we're most likely to have on hand. All right, and actually in this photograph here, the bright red foliage that you see is actually a eucalyptus that's been preserved with glycerin that had a red dye. So you can see what that looks like versus having brown foliage, you can get brightly colored foliage. So that's just kind of neat. But now that we've talked about all of these different ways that you can preserve flowers and foliage, you might be wondering, okay, so what am I going to do with all of these dried plant materials? And there's really about as many things as you can imagine you can do with that dried plant material. But some of the typical things are making arrangements. For our pressed flowers, a lot of times people will make things like greeting cards or bookmarks, stationery, two-dimensional crafts like that. You can also, with your three-dimensional preserved flowers, do something like a shadow box. And another thing you can do with your pressed flowers is to make, for lack of a better word, pressed flower paintings. So essentially just making a three-dimensional picture with your, or not a three-dimensional, a two-dimensional picture with your pressed flowers that you would frame and hang as wall art. So there's lots of different uses for dried flowers, but the nice thing is that they're great for a lot of different decorative projects. And one other thing that I do want to mention is that not all plant materials require any special preservation techniques in order to be used in dried arrangements. And one really good example of this is boxwood. And so while there's not a whole lot of great benefits about boxwood or a whole lot of nice things to say about it, I have one nice thing to say about boxwood, and that's that it's a green that you can use in a dried arrangement straight from the plant. So you can use it fresh and then it will dry gradually over time in that arrangement. So this is what fresh boxwood looks like if you haven't seen it. Back in this picture here, the tan kind of foliage, you can recognize those leaves. Those are boxwood. branches that were used in this arrangement. And so you can see that over time it loses its color, it goes to tan, but you use it fresh, and so at the beginning the arrangement has bright green foliage. Over time that color fades, but you didn't have to do anything special in order to use it. Also in this same arrangement, you'll notice some other things that don't really require special treatment, like the red twig dogwood branches that are in there. Those you can cut from a bush anytime you want, don't have to do anything special, and just use them in your arrangement. Also things like sorghum seed heads, doesn't really require any special treatment because they dry naturally on the plant. And like our seed heads from Black-Eyed Susan, once the petals have fallen off and that seed head is dry, that's another thing that you can use. And you didn't really have to do anything special to it. So again, a lot of our naturally dried seed heads off of ornamental grasses or other flowers like our coneflowers are things that we don't have to work to use. And so those are just some things to keep in mind, is that not everything requires extra effort. And so there's a lot of things you can forage and still use in dried arrangements. And so now I do want to go through some of the resources that I used to put together this presentation that I really encourage you to go to for more details. The first is a University of Missouri Extension publication called Drying Flowers and Foliage for Arrangements. This publication has really great step-by-step instructions for several of these methods of preservation that I talked about. And what's also really nice about this guide is it has a more extensive list of the different species of foliage and flowers that work well for the different methods. So I do encourage you to look up this guide. It's available as a PDF on the internet, so that's a great one to look up. Another source that I used for this presentation was a book by Armitage and Loshman called Specialty Cut Flowers. And this is a reference material really that is focused on cut flower growers, but there is also a section on preservation. And so I did utilize some of the information that they had in their chapter on preserving flowers. So if you're looking for some technical details, this can be a good source for that. And the last source that I will mention is the Pressed Flower Picture Book by Irene Flesher. And this book is a really great wealth of ideas and information, also really detailed instructions on how to make pressed flower paintings. And Irene Flesher was extremely detailed-oriented and made beautiful work. So this is just a photo that I took of one of the color plates in the book. But I will note this book was published in 1978, and I'm really quite certain it's not in print anymore, but you can get used copies at perhaps your local bookstore or used bookstore, and there are used copies available online. But this is just a great kind of inspiration of how detailed you can be. Of course, you don't have to be this intense when you do work with pressed flowers. A lot of times I just do really simple things like a bookmark, and rather than gluing individual flowers down, I'll just take packing tape and use it as sort of like a pseudo lamination and just get those flowers arranged the way I want them on my note card, and then go over them with packing tape to keep them in place. So it can be really simple, or it can be really detailed and complicated. And it's just up to you and the needs of your project, or what you're really going to have time to do. So like I said, you don't have to stress about making it as elaborate as this, but you definitely have resources if you want to learn how. All right, with that, I have my contact information up here, so if you have questions later and want to reach out to me, go ahead and do that. But I'm also ready now for anybody out there that wants to ask questions. You can open your mic and ask, or you can type them in the chat box, and I'm happy to answer. But I do also want to just thank you for listening and joining us this evening. I will also note that you can view this program again and any of our past Four Seasons webinars on our YouTube channel. And so the YouTube channel is listed here. So it'll take them a little bit before they put this particular presentation up. But all of our past ones are archived, and this one will go up there in a couple weeks. So if you're interested in learning more about any garden topics, you can check out our Four Seasons recordings and see those presentations from past Four Seasons gardening series.